Started on Tuesday talking about the Great Depression of the 1930s, and we will be continuing with the discussion of the Great Depression next week. But it makes sense to actually think about the Great Depression that we're in the middle of right now. And to actually just one sense of my sense of what, a teach-in on the subject of public education and budget crisis in the state of California has to do a number of things. There we go, that's good enough. One of which is to explain, right, what is going on. The other is to explain, like, why, what is at stake, and then lastly, like, what does this actually mean to any of you, to any of us? And that's the larger picture, right? You as students in the University of California, many of you products of public education systems in California, and myself and your GSIs and everyone who works here as public employees, right? We are employees. We work for the state of California. And so the state of California, you might have noticed, is in rather severe economic crisis, which really is not an economic crisis. It's a political crisis. The state of California is not broke. We are the wealthiest state in the union. We have more billionaires in California than any other state in the union. But yet we imagine ourselves to be so broke that we have to close elementary schools and endlessly increase your tuition. Why? Why is that the case? This is essentially what we want to take up, what I want to try and address directly. And this will take. I'm going to take a little bit of time, 20 minutes or so with this. Then your fellow GSI or co-teacher Chris Petrella is going to make some comments as well on this subject around public education. And so just briefly, like, what is going on today? Right now, there are teach-ins going on in Sproul Plaza, or at least under the eaves of the Cesar Chavez Center. The rain is going to stop. At least my all-knowing, all-seeing iPhone says that it's going to stop at about 11 o'clock. So the rain, I don't think is going to be an issue. It's going to look like it did yesterday. It's going to dry up. So I don't think that that's a problem. There'll be a noon rally at Sproul Plaza in which will lead to a march down to downtown Oakland, to Oscar Grant Frank-Ogawa Plaza in Oakland, which is the convergence point of the East Bay coalition to defend public education. And I think it's important because this is not just a Berkeley thing. This is actually statewide. The Oakland teachers unions, the Berkeley teachers unions, the whole of the American Federation of Teachers in the state of California is joining in the protests and the walkouts. Public sector employees all across California are joining in walkouts, and indeed, this actually is extended to student strikes in New York City, in Ohio, in Chicago, and indeed in London, the largest public sector education union, about 325,000 employees in England, are on strike today as well. So this is a kind of international day of protest on behalf of public education. So this is not just a Berkeley thing. For what it's worth, this is a statewide thing, and it's designed to coincide with the beginning of the budget process in Sacramento. That in Sacramento, they're now going to begin the extremely ugly process of developing what next year's budget is going to be and how to meet a $20 billion budget shortfall, nearly a 20% or so budget shortfall in the state of California, with the understanding that, as it has been so far, that the only way to actually make that budget gap is through cuts. Cuts, cuts, and cuts. To fire nurses, fire janitors, fire garbage men, fire professors, and of course raise your student fees further, right? And that this is the basic process, and that because the state legislature is so broken, because the state is so ungovernable, that we rather firmly believe that only a large-scale mass mobilization is capable of actually restoring the state to its proper sense of priorities. Which is basically to say that the state needs revenue. It needs to raise taxes. It needs to raise taxes on millionaires, on movie stars, yachts, and oil extraction, because that's where the money is, and they can afford it. And unless the population actually stands up and demands this, it isn't going to happen. So part of what this is the setup for is that people will then beginning what is called the 99-mile march up to Sacramento. Now, it's not 99 miles to Sacramento, but I don't care. It's a good slogan. And on March 5th, there will be a massive sets of protests at the Capitol in Sacramento, including a kind of Wisconsin-style effort to occupy the Capitol in Sacramento. So for those of you who don't like protests here at Berkeley and say, well, the problems with the state legislature, you should be going to Sacramento, now is your chance to not put your foot in your mouth. Go to Sacramento. Sign up at occupyeducationcalifornia.org, and you can get a free ride on a bus up to Sacramento and enjoy the public protests in Sacramento that day. You can get a bus ride home, too. It's very convenient. Totally free. No one will charge you anything for the buses. So if you want to go and actually engage, in lobbying your representative or showing the state of California what's at stake here, you are invited to. Now, what then is the bigger picture? Right? So this is the events for Sacramento. Mass marches to the Capitol, the various lobbying efforts. Birgeneau sent you an email, right? You may have noticed this. Like, we're not really going to join hands with Birgeneau. But what is interesting is that this is a statewide day in which there's all kinds of forms of lobbying in Sacramento, but it's traditionally very kind of highbrow, with really rich Democrats shaking hands with Democratic representatives, or just the ASUCs or UCSAs engaging. And it's not a day traditionally in the past, UC Lobby Day is not a day for mass mobilization. So we're actually taking up UC Lobby Day as a day for mass mobilization. Because it's a lot easier to sort of glad hand the chancellor and say, yes, we're doing everything we can, and then do nothing. And it's a lot more difficult to actually address tens of thousands of impoverished students, because y'all are voters, right? So this is the effort, right, to actually change the narrative in the state of California. So what is then at stake in all of this? And I've showed you this chart before, and I think that this is extremely important because it presents for us a narrative of American history, but it shows us absolutely what's at stake in all of this. This is a chart created by Piketty and Saz, and Emmanuel Saz is a professor of economics here at UC Berkeley. And Piketty is a French political economist, I believe. Anyways, they have studied the United States tax records, income tax records, since 1917, which was the first year that they occurred, and created, through reams of economic data, evidence of economic stratification, economic inequality in terms of income in the United States. And this is just income, okay? This is how much money is in your paycheck, per year that you pay income tax on. And what they found is that, right, starting in 1917, this chart, this line, is essentially a narrative of American history from 1917 to 2007. And what you get in this is the percentage of wealth, the percentage of the total income of the United States that is drawn by the richest 10%, the top decile, the wealthiest 10% of Americans. All right, now, what you get starting in 1917, this sharp line upward is what we've been narrating to this point. This is the 1920s, right? Boom, this sharp, rather steep line upward. Now, let's put this in colloquial terms. What does it mean to have this line go way up like that? Pow, it goes up like that. Now, what does that mean? In very basic terms, it means the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. That's what that means, right? Because you can't have 110% of the national income. You can only have 100% of the national income. If the richest one-tenth is getting more and more and more, that means that the bottom 90% are getting less and less and less, right? The rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And that's what marks this era up through the 1920s. Now, you'll notice this peak here, right? The top moment of that. Now, what does that coincide with? The 1929 stock market crash and the start of the Great Depression. The sense that income inequality, that the vast majority of the national wealth is going to people who already have it, and that the people at the bottom are being stripped of their wealth, creates conditions in which the vast majority of Americans cannot afford to buy all of the things that keep a consumer economy going. And as a result, the economy crashes. Now, you get this steep downward pitch and a lot of, bouncing around here. And this is the era of the New Deal and the Great Depression, right? Now, this huge readjustment in the imbalance between rich and poor in the United States is not the product of the New Deal, but the Second World War. World War II created a situation in which Franklin Roosevelt increased taxes on corporations and the wealthy in a massive, massive way, necessary to do things like build a military, build an army and an air force, design, develop, test, and deploy the nuclear bomb, right? This massive consumption of wealth by the government to create the war machine that could win the war created from 1942 to 1975 what economists refer to as the Great Compression, a period in American history that represents the greatest prolonged period of economic egalitarianism in U.S. history. That the gap between rich and poor, the concentration of wealth at the top of the scale was severely compressed. This was a period in which the United States, from the late 1940s to the early 1970s, created the strongest, wealthiest, most powerful middle class the world had ever seen. And in this, one of the great markers of that, which emerged in a very important way, was the master plan of higher education in California, which comes in 1960. Now, the master plan grew out of the GI Bill. The GI Bill was a promise made to the men who fought the Second World War that they would receive a free education, a free higher education. And so in this period, millions of Americans who had fought in the Second World War went to college for the first time. So many that the University of California and the public higher education sector had to expand radically. And so in 1960, Clark Kerr established, who was the president of the University of California system at the time, the master plan for California public higher education, which set the three-tier system that we have. Of the UCs, the 10 UCs, right, which with Berkeley and UCLA at the very pinnacle, right, and all of the other UCs, there are 10 now, there weren't then. They built Santa Cruz and Merced since then, and that's it, right? 2 UCs in the last 50 years. It's not a very strong rate of growth. In fact, it's dismal. But they also then created the Cal State system, Cal State East Bay, Cal State San Francisco, Cal State, San Luis Obispo, wherever, right? All of those, and that's the second tier. And then below that is the third tier, which is the community college system, which many of you probably came through as transfer students, right? Now, what this is a system by which the state of California promised every citizen that they could, to the level of their own ability, attend college for little or absolutely no cost whatsoever, that it would essentially be free. And by providing the highest quality public education to the largest number of people, in this period of the Great Compression, California created a public education system that was the envy and the model of the entire world. This was the period in which the University of California at Berkeley could righteously brag of being the best public institution in the world, because it was. And it's true. It's quite true. This institution was never so great, never so as important as when it was absolutely, positively, 100% free to attend. Free. This university, while it was at its peak of influence, charged nothing in tuition, zero. It was free. You still had to pay for rent, books, food, things like that. But it was free. Right? And it's important to think about, right? And because this is about you as well, right? Why do you come to college? Is it just so that you can, drink beer and experiment with your sexuality? Yeah. That's good enough reason. I mean, you're entitled to do that while you're here, absolutely, right? You're totally entitled to do that while you're here. But is that really why you're here? Is that why your parents sent you here? Probably not, right? Your parents sent you here to make you middle class, to turn you into the middle class, so that you could be, right, you could buy a house and a car and have a stable job, right, and work for more than minimum wage, so that you could become middle class. That's what colleges and universities are for, is the creation of a middle class, a transfer of those who are working class or the children of the working class can come to college and become middle class. Public education are the great vehicles of class uplift, and they have been for a very long time. And with every assault on the tuition, right, at public universities, the ability for working class people to become middle class is severely eroded. And we are in the condition at this moment as we strip ourselves of this kind of free higher education. We're actually waging a full-scale assault on the American middle class, right? And the middle class is getting smaller and smaller with each coming year, more and more desperate, right? So what happens then in this period? Now, I think it's important to understand that this is the period of peak egalitarianism in the United States economically, but it is not racially. From 1940, from way back over here, from emancipation to right about here, 1965, African Americans, by and large, could not vote in this country and were prevented from gaining access to the social wage provided by relatively high taxation, right? So black folks couldn't vote, they couldn't use public transportation, they couldn't gain access to public universities because of Jim Crow, right? And so starting right with the 1965 Voting Rights Act and this movement here, you get two pressures that begin to build up from 65 to 1975. One is that African Americans begin to prosper in a very serious way. They find political representation which benefits their communities locally. Jobs, which had previously been closed to them, are opened up. And 1975 represents the peak of African American economic well-being. So for those of you who are black and have parents who are nostalgic for the 1970s, it's not just because of blaxploitation films and funk music and really cool hairstyles. It's because, right, that's when black folks prospered in a very serious way. So that's one. The second, though, is that process bred a very severe reaction, a huge blowback against feminism, against the civil rights movement, against the gay and lesbian, bisexual, transgendered liberation movement, against student rebellions that produced the great backlash that is Ronald Reagan and modern American conservatism. So you will notice that this line begins to tick up radically starting in 1980 with the economic transformation brought about by Ronald Reagan. Now, the Reagan Revolution did a number of things. It instituted what we today know of as neoliberalism. Neoliberalism basically believes that the free market is the sole arbiter of economic value and ethical right, that the free market should decide everything and only the free market, and that the state and any form of state intervention is somehow an unjust intervention into the natural laws of the free market. Okay, that's the basic tenets of neoliberalism. So neoliberalism is about privatization, corporatization, the transformation of everything into a price-benefit calculus. So Ronald Reagan, when he comes in, does a number of things. First of all, is he lowers taxes on the rich dramatically. Second, and we get the whole language of trickle-down economics, which is a great idea, but it doesn't work. There's no evidence that it works at all. In fact, all of the evidence, as we demonstrate here, is quite counter, right? Secondly, he leads a full-scale assault on private sector unions, beginning with his war on PATCO, which was the Air Traffic Controllers Union, which he's utterly destroyed and created new legal conditions by which public sector unions began to erode. This period here, the Great Compression, also coincides with the highest percentage of private sector unionism in the United States, right? Union families, union-based representatives are and have been historically the greatest advocates for a middle class in America. right? Because Reagan's third thing, just to finish here, Reagan's third thing, is that he deregulated industry radically. A radical deregulation of industry. Privatization of industry, right? So the airline industry was deregulated. And if you want to know why it is such a miserable, meat-packing experience to fly in the United States, because the industry has been deregulated, right? And so what you get starting with Ronald Reagan is this process. Now, those of you who are less than 40, right, have grown up in and never known a world that was not driven by the basic dynamics of the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. That's what this line indicates. Now, just so we're clear here, and I'm not being partisan here, this line, you will also notice, makes perhaps its most radical leap up during the Clinton administration. That Bill Clinton, as ferocious a neoliberal as Ronald Reagan, facilitated this by destroying welfare, by continuing the prospects of privatization, and by turning the Democratic Party into an adjunct of Wall Street in the same way that the Republicans always were. All right, so Bill Clinton actually made this process worse, not better. And it should be said that this process continues unabated. This is a major kind of stock market crash that happened early, and then this represents, right, the Bush years. All right. Now this is the top 10%. Let's look at this. This is the top 1%. So if you look here, in 1929, the richest 1% of Americans owned 23.9% of the nation's wealth or income. If you look here, this is 2005, and now we have now surpassed this. Okay, so we're now kind of up here. We're at least in the 25% range. That the top 1% owns fully a quarter. 1%, the richest 3 million households, own nearly a quarter of the wealth in this country. Okay? Now this is all based on Piketty and Saz's data. It's just a different representation of it. Now, to whom, right, what does this mean on a basic level? Well, all right, we're breaking this down here. This is from the Congressional Budget Office data. And what you can see is that the top 1%'s wealth since 1979, since Ronald Reagan came into office, has increased fully 281% since 1980. Whereas everyone else has been more or less stagnant. All right, the bottom 40% have seen relatively stagnant income growth. But the rich have gotten unbelievably richer. All right, now how is what does this distribution actually look like? Here, this is another good graphic representation. I love infographics. This is a great representation. Okay, again, same source, Saz, okay. The bottom 90% of the American population has an average annual income of $31,244. Average. Bottom 90%. Okay? Average income. All right? The top 10% then, right, this group here, has an average income of $164,000 a year. The top 1% here has an annual income of $1.1 million a year. That's the top 1%, right? And then we get farther up. So the top 0.1% to top 0.01 has an annual income of $3.2 million, and the top 0.01% has an average annual income of $27,342,000 a year. Now, to use one example who's in the news, right? Mitt Romney had to release his income tax returns, and it was demonstrated that he made $44 million last year, based almost exclusively on investments. He said that his taxable income, he said someone was, well, I accumulate some money in speaker's fees, but it's not too much. Or it's not a lot, right? What counted to him as not a lot was $325,000 in speaker's fees in a single year. Okay, that's more than 99% of the American population. What he considers not a lot is more than, 300 million Americans make in a year. All right? So this is how ill-distributed wealth is in this country. Now, it also needs to be said, that our policies in the United States, federal policies, national policies, state policies, are actually being dictated by these people. Okay? 50% of the members of Congress have annual incomes of over $1 million a year. The single wealthiest U.S. senator, Dianne Feinstein, Democrat from the state of California, married to Richard Blum, who is also on the Board of Regents of the University of California. So we are actually being governed by the wealthy, being governed by the rich. Now, what does that mean, right? One of the things that means is these are people who don't need private schools, who don't need public parks, don't need public transportation. These are people who send their kids to the wealthiest private schools in the country, who have limousines, or in Mitt Romney's case, a couple of Cadillacs, and who have beachfront property on their multiple vacation homes. So what do they need public parks for? Public pools. They have 3 pools in their backyard. What do they need a public pool for? Right? These are people who actually have no skin in the game. They have nothing at stake in terms of the public sector. Right? What is it that makes a middle class? In this country, there's nothing more social democratic than a middle class. The middle class needs a social democracy in order to exist, right? What do you need if you're going to survive in the middle class? You need public schools, you need public parks, you need public transportation, and you need a very sophisticated and well-funded public health sector. You need socialized medicine. You do know that, right, that illness is the second leading cause of bankruptcy in the United States. In this country, the only country in the Western world, do you risk poverty by falling ill? Not just because you lose your job and there's no guarantee you get it back, but because getting sick is incredibly expensive. Healthcare in this country is not a human right. It is a very expensive commodity. Okay? So the wealthiest, the people who actually govern this country and govern the state of California and govern the University of California system, they don't care about any of those things. They're vastly wealthy. They sit on the board of directors of Bank of America, of various construction firms, of Hollywood studios, of Wells Fargo Bank. They've got no skin in the game. They're not going to send their kids to the University of California, right? When they can afford to send them to Harvard, Stanford, or wherever they want to. They cost unbelievable amounts of money, all right? So this is the problem that we're facing, right? We're essentially being governed by, and policies are being set by, people who have no interest or involvement in the public sector, right? And as a result, the public sector is withering, and with it, the middle class. Now, this has a very, very important racial component to it, racialized component. Poverty has a distinct color in this country, right? And that should come as no surprise. Now, what we're looking at here, the median net worth of households between 2005 and 2009. Okay, so we're talking about a 4-year gap here. Now, you might remember what had happened between 2005 and 2009. And I'm not just talking about Obama. I'm talking about the largest annihilation of wealth in perhaps world history. Trillions of dollars of wealth simply eradicated by the 2008 financial collapse. So what this says is that in 2005, the average net worth of white households in the United States was $143,000. Now, what that means, this is not income, this is wealth. Okay? The difference is wealth is all, the sum total of all the things you own in the world. So in particular, what this means is, for most middle-class Americans, it means a house, a home, right? You own a home. So this is the sum. If you took everything that you owned and sold it, like this is your total worth, okay? So the average white families have, in 2005, it was $134,000, but by 2009, it had dropped to $113,000. This is what suffering from the economic crisis looks like, okay? And so white folks have seen, right, as this indicates here, a 16% drop in the total net worth of white families in 4 years. Now, for Hispanics, the big question here, and I'll just use their term here, but like the average wealth, total wealth of a Hispanic family is only $18,359, which in 4 years dropped by 66%. African Americans, total net worth is only $12,000. White families, even in good times, in 2005, had 20 times the average net wealth of average black families. 20 times. And we're supposed to be a colorblind society, right? But yet African Americans also, in 4 years, have experienced a 53% drop in their net wealth. This is what a Great Depression looks like. Now, the joke is always that a recession is when your neighbor loses their job, but a depression is when you lose yours. All right? That just shows you how little empathy we actually have when it comes to the economy. So, you know, this is the Great Depression. This is the Great Recession. It is racial. It is coded. Now, this, what's at stake in this? Like, what are the solutions to this? One of them is taxation. Part of the problem is taxation. This line indicates how much of the share of federal tax revenue comes from what source. Now, what you see here, this is individual income tax. This is H&R Block TurboTax, right? That all of you or your parents have to fill in based on your own taxation rates. So essentially, between 40 and 50% of the nation's revenue, this is the federal government's revenue. Now, we're not even going to talk about what they spend that on. Well, 49 cents of every tax dollar goes to weapons and the Pentagon, to fight wars and develop weapon systems and design nuclear weapons and things like that, okay? We are the most militarized nation in the history of humanity. So half of this goes straight to the Pentagon for whatever good. I'll let you decide yourself. But you can see it fluctuates, but it's relatively stable. Now, this is what's key here. Payroll tax has gone up and up and up to the point where it is now a very large percentage of the tax revenue coming into the United States. Now, what's the payroll tax? Any of you have jobs? Anybody here work shite jobs for minimum wage? I did. I don't anymore, thankfully. But like, I get a paycheck. My pay stub is in my email inbox, right? I get my pay stub. You look at it and it says, okay, this is your income. And then this is a payroll tax. This is what you get to keep. And if any of you ever read these, it's kind of shocking how big that gap is between this is how much you earned and this is how much you get to have. The fuck, right? Okay, that's what this is. That's what this is. Okay, now what is this? This is how much tax corporations have been paying. Now you will notice particularly starting in the 1970s, an extremely precipitous decline in the percentage of federal tax that comes from corporations and businesses. Now, the Republicans will whine that the United States has the highest rate of corporate taxation in the world. And that might be if you look at it on paper, but if you pay attention to the legislative process, every time a bill gets passed that spends anything, a vast chunk of that is corporate giveaways tax giveaways to corporations. So in the end, the official tax rate for a corporate tax rate is like 38%, I think. It sounds high, but the effective corporate tax rate is somewhere in the single digits, often less. Okay, if any of you actually have any money in your wallets right now, you have on hand more money than Chevron, Texaco, and General Electric paid in taxes to the federal government all last year. They paid $0 in taxation. 3 of the largest corporations in the United States paid $0 in taxation. In fact, many of them got rebates from the federal government to the tunes of hundreds of millions of dollars a year in the form of corporate welfare. So why is it that you all have to pay all of the taxes, but the corporations that are making record profits on industries that are killing the planet, like oil, they pay nothing, and in fact, they get huge amounts of money back? Is this how we're supposed to be running the wealthiest, most prosperous middle class in the world? Clearly not. So what are the effects here then for us? What are the consequences? If the state is broke because of bad taxation policies, what does this mean for us? Well, one of the things that means for us is skyrocketing tuition rates. Now, this is tuition growth since 1982, 1984. And you can see that the rate of tuition increase for colleges has exceeded every other major economic sector. Medical care has gone up dramatically. Here's median family income. You can see that it's barely going up. Here's the consumer price index. This is colleges and universities, right? Now, what's important is this gap. Okay, median family income, college, this gap, this space in here. Right. Now, I mean, I'll come back to that. This, I think, is rather, this shows, you know, all of that tuition that's coming in, right, all that money that's coming in to pay for schools. Where does it go? Well, one of it is that it goes to the football coach. The football coach at the University of California is the highest paid public official in the state of California. He's an annual income of over $2 million. He makes more money than the governor. In fact, he makes more money than the entire state legislature combined. The second highest paid official in the state of California is the UCLA basketball coach. Now, if you think that those are appropriate priorities, I wonder. Personally, I think they need to just privatize college football. Like, if we're going to privatize everything else, why not just privatize college football? Just sell. You can be the Google Golden Bears. I don't have any problem with that. Just sell them. You still get to play. Right, you still get to go. It'll be the UC Berkeley Google Golden Bears. Sell the stadium, right, and just let them be a completely private franchise. I don't have a problem. I think that's a great idea, right? Because now here's me, and here's your GSI, here's your professors, here's but then boom! This is average. For Berkeley, it's actually kind of up here. It's actually twice. It's more up there. All right, so. Now, that's not to, I say this and that, this is not to indict student athletes, this is not to indict the football team and the students who are here to play football. This is to indict the system. Like, I have nothing against successful student athletes, okay? I'm proud of you all, okay? I don't think your coach deserves that much money, though. I don't. And I don't think that I should be paying for your coach to have that much money through my taxes and your student fees, okay? Now, to come back to this, what is this gap? How are we doing? What is this gap? Where do we fill this gap with? What do you fill this gap with? The gap between how much money your family earns and how much it costs to go to college. What do you fill that gap with? Student loans. Debt. Massive, massive spiraling debt. Okay. Now, what do so this, we'll come back to the debt issue we'll come back to. I have 2 more slides of this, right? Okay, so this is UC Berkeley's tuition increases since 1990. Right? You see, about $2,100, $2,200 a year in 1990 to now where it's actually over, $12,500? It's $12,500 a year. And that's in-state tuition, right? In-state tuition. So what you're looking at is that tuition for the University of California has quadrupled, right, in the last 20 years. It's important to note that while Ronald Reagan cut taxes on the rich and did all of that, he's also the first, when he was governor of California, he was the man who inaugurated student fees in the UC system. He was the guy who started the U paying tuition, right? But so this is what's been approved, right? Here we have state support for UC versus student fees. So as the state of, and look at this. This line indicates recession. It's like, oh, lots of money, no money. Lots of money, no money. Lots of money, no money. And each time, right, the state pays less and less and less to the University of California. They raise your tuition more and more and more. All right. Now, this has a number of things. One is that the University of California system, which used to be the envy of the world, used to be the greatest bargain in the history of public education, is now less so. Right? Because the less money they spend on this place, the more they cut, the more they erode classes and the viability of this institution, the more that it costs, the less good a deal this is. And indeed, the University of California system has severely outpaced the national average in terms of undergraduate tuition fees. That the fees at UC Berkeley have gone up at a considerably higher rate than the rest of the national average. Yeah? I don't know exactly. Do you know? 12%. So we used to be a state school. Now we're a state-located school. Right? That in this, the idea of a public university, I don't know if Chris is going to talk about this, but like the idea of a public education is that the state pays for your education because it's a social good, right? Now we're in a situation where you're paying for your education, right? Your student fees are going to pay for your education. Now, that may be okay at Stanford, right? Because that's private and that's what that's for. But a public education should be that the state subsidizes your education because there is a public benefit to having an educated public. We have totally lost that sensibility, right? And to boot, what does the university spend its money on besides $2 million for the football coach? More and more administrators, managers, supervisors, people that would not recognize an undergraduate if they bumped into one in the hallways, right? They wouldn't. These are people that never encounter undergraduates in any capacity at all. Meanwhile, except perhaps in an advisory role, but those people are really small. I'm talking deans, chancellors, vice deans, vice chancellors, vice deans, the endless proliferation of bureaucracy that makes this place so unresponsive, so slow, so ineffective as a dynamic institution. You've got more and more administrators and fewer faculty. And these are tenured faculty here. This line is now crossed. There are actually more management salaries at UC than there are faculty salaries at UC. And that's ladder faculty. That's tenured faculty. That is not people like me, who is a lecturer, or Chris, who is a GSI, or Megan, who are GSIs, right? At this point, the majority of your education, in terms of professor-student time, in terms of hours spent in the classroom, more, at this point, non-tenured faculty, non-tenured teaching staff does more than half of the teaching at this university. Tenured professors who are all off doing the research that wins them Nobel Prizes that they promised you would work with in the brochures, they're not working with you. You will never encounter them. You encounter underpaid, overworked people like me and them. And the vast majority of your other professors who are essentially non-tenured, casualized academic labor. All right? Now, this is the last point, and then we'll turn it to, I'll hand this over. But this is that line, okay? Real earnings, here's the gap, right? Real tuition fees, we saw this earlier. This is real earnings of full-time workers aged 25 to 34 with a bachelor's degree only. That's you after you graduate. Okay? This is what you can, this is the rate, essentially the real earnings. And what this essentially amounts to is that it's all but flat. Okay? It's statistically flat. The people with college degrees since 1991 have seen no considerable increase in their income. At the same time, tuition and fees have gone up and up and up. Now, what do you fill this gap in here with? Debt. Yours is a generation that is shackled to mountains of debt. And because of changes in the student loan policies signed into law by the Obama administration, those student loan debts are almost impossible to get out from underneath. You can declare, if you default on your mortgage, you can walk away from your home. If you can't pay back your credit card, you can negotiate a settlement or you can declare bankruptcy. But if you declare bankruptcy, it may hurt your credit limit, but you still have to pay your student loans back. And you will have to pay them back until the day that you die. There is no getting out from underneath student loans anymore. I'm nearly 40 and I'm still paying my student loans back. Right? Many of you will, and with every tick upward, that's more student loans. That's a life that is dedicated to paying off an education that for most of the UC regents, like Richard Blum, when he attended the University of California, it was free. This guy's a billionaire, right? A billionaire who got a free education. But yet he thinks that it is okay to charge you more and more and more and more. Because that's okay. That's going to keep UC's bond rating where it needs to be to borrow money to build buildings that none of you will ever get to go into. Like athletic centers, football stadiums, labs where they do research for Chevron and Texaco and British Petroleum. All right. So this, in short, and there's a lot more to say about this, and Chris will say some of it. This is why we protest. This is why public education is important. This is why we march on the Capitol and insist that the state of California pay attention to our needs, the ordinary people who need quality public education. They need it to be affordable. And so, my sensibility says that we essentially, while we have many demands, we, the organization, we, Occupy, we, anyone who cares about public education, we may articulate our demands in various ways. For me, I have one demand, that UC should be free. It should be free. It should cost you nothing to attend this place. Goodness knows it's expensive enough to live in the East Bay, let alone buy books and eat the gourmet food they keep trying to shove down your gullets. Goodness knows it's expensive enough just to live here, right? Let alone actually, right, be a student and pay your student fees. UC should be free. And the state has enough money. We have enough money to do that. We can afford to provide you with free education. And with a free education, you can go out there and do whatever it is you want to do because you are not shackled to mountains of debt. You can be Richard Blum and be an entrepreneur and do all kinds of things because your credit rating isn't already ruined by taking out $50,000 in student loans, right? You can be an artist, an actor. You can dream because you know that you don't have to start earning an income the instant you graduate because you've got to pay back your student loans, right? I think that and student loans today, actually, the largest source of consumer household debt. They've actually surpassed credit card debt as the leading source of consumer debt in this country. Lastly, there is a serious conflict of interest going on in this as well. You've got 3 members of the UC Board of Regents that sit on the board of directors of the 4 largest banks in America, who are accumulating huge amounts of money in profits for high-interest, for-profit student loans. So every time the UC Board of Regents assigns a tuition increase, every time they increase your tuition, that means Sherry Lansing, who sits on the board of directors of Bank of America, her company is making huge amounts of money. Their profits are going up because you have to take out more loans. Guess who's the largest provider of commercial student loans in the United States? Bank of America. Now, in more honest days, we would call that corruption. We would call that criminal. We would call that unfair and unjust, a conflict of interests. Today, that is standard operating procedure in the privatized University of California. So that is why we protest.